afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Menachem Begin Heritage Centre in Jerusalem. It's a great pleasure. Paul Gross, or Gross as Americans say. I saw someone mouthing. If I can remind you to switch your phones off, and pages outside. Okay. Many of you are not new to the events that we do here for English speakers, both in person and on Zoom. And you'll know that we look at issues, either contemporary issues or sometimes historical issues, that are relevant for Israel and the Jewish people writ large, the wider Middle East sometimes as well. And of course, in the last year now, there's been a particular focus on the current situation, for obvious reasons. 2 days ago, we all marked 1 year since that day. I'm sure I'm not the only one here who firstly wonders where the year went, and also at how strange and disconcerting it was to be marking something when we all still feel very much that we're in the middle of it. But it's not like marking wars gone by or other tragedies of the Jewish people when we're in a different world. We're really not in a different world. We're still in that world. We're still in the world where we have hostages in Gaza, where tens of thousands of Israelis can't return to their homes, where our soldiers are being killed, where just today, some of you will know that 2 people, civilians, were killed by a rocket in Kiryat Shmona. There were 6 people injured in a stabbing terrorist attack in Hadera. So we are very much in the midst of this still. Nevertheless, I think we are indebted to the journalists, reporters, writers who have made it their business to explain to us what's been going on and what happened. And we're very fortunate to have with us one of those reporters today who's written one of the first books in English. I think that's the first book that's been originally written in English about what happened on October 7th and some of the aftermath of that. So we're very fortunate and honoured to have Seth Frantzman with us this evening. I'm going to introduce Seth. He's going to give a short presentation about his book, and then we're going to hear a discussion between Seth and our other guest, another long-time friend of the Begin Centre, Fleur Hassan-Nahul. So let me first introduce Seth. I'll introduce Fleur a little later. Seth Frantzman is an adjunct fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and the senior Middle East analyst at the Jerusalem Post. He covers the Israeli defense industry for Breaking Defense. He was previously the op-ed editor of the Jerusalem Post and also wrote for Defense News. He's covered conflict in the Middle East for more than a decade. He covered the war against Islamic State, 5 Gaza wars, the conflict in Ukraine, the refugee crises in Eastern Europe, and also reported from Iraq, Turkey, Jordan, Egypt, Senegal, the UAE, Ukraine, and Russia. Prior to this book, he wrote After ISIS, America, Iran, and the Struggle for the Middle East, and Drone Wars, Pioneers, Killing Machines, and the Battle for the Future, and he's contributed articles to an impressively long list of publications. He has a PhD from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He lectured in American Studies at Al-Quds University, and he's currently the Executive Director of the Middle East Center for Reporting and Analysis, and is a writing fellow at the Middle East Forum. Seth Frantzman.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thank you so much. Does this work? Good. Thank you all for coming. I hope that some of you have got a book. If not, afterward, I'll be there to sign some of them, and they have them for sale. And there's also some wine out there, so hopefully people can have a bit of an enjoyable evening as much as they can. As Paul said, alluded to, we are just in the beginning of this conflict.
Microphone.
Yeah, louder, yes?
Put it closer to you.
Yeah, okay, fine. We're just in the, I think it's the beginning of this terrible conflict. Maybe the end of the beginning, as I think that Churchill had a phrase like that. So, unfortunately, that's the bad news. And I don't come to bring good news. I did come to talk a little bit about this book and a little bit about maybe how it came to be. And I'm happy, we'll have a little talk, and then maybe I'm happy to answer some questions. So, to give a background, Paul read a little bit of this biography of mine. I've studied here and this and that, but just to get a sense, I think, of how we got here, I think is worth telling, and how this project came about and why it came about in the way it did. Because there is a question is, why would you write a book in a conflict that's obviously going to go on for a while, apparently? I mean, I think when I started to write it, it was early in the war. We did think, maybe the conflict in Gaza would be over by the end of the year, even if this multi-front struggle against Iranian proxies would continue and continue. But the reason I wrote it was, I had been in Israel since 2004. I came here originally to study at the Hebrew University and to study history and geography and other things. And if you recall 2004, most of you are old enough to recall it, it was the Second Intifada. And if you were here at that time, you probably recall that the Second Intifada was kind of winding down at the time. The era of the worst bus bombings in Jerusalem was kind of winding down. There was a lot of security. You go to a restaurant, people would wand you sometimes. Remember that? I think even the new terminal at the airport still wasn't working. And I remember when I'd first come, there were guys checking the trash cans in case there were bombs at the time. I mean, it was a bit tense, but things were on the upswing in terms of the worst part of it. So it was an interesting time to come. And very soon after that, we had the disengagement from Gaza. And I actually had I don't know if I'd say it's the privilege, whatever I'd call it, I actually got to go to Gaza for a Shabbat to one of the communities there prior to the disengagement. It was a community called Netzer Chazani. It was very close to Khan Yunis. Khan Yunis, we've probably all become familiar with in the last year of fighting. It's a big city. It's a big city that's close to, not so far from the Egyptian border. It's in southern Gaza. And it happens to be the hometown of Yahya Sinwar, our arch enemy there. Yahya Sinwar grew up in Khan Yunis. When he was a young man, he joined Hamas, or a younger man in the 80s, and he joined Hamas. He was around most of the founders of Hamas. At the time, Hamas was part of this Islamist movement, Muslim Brotherhood, that had roots in Egypt and other places. It started out as a bloody movement. It didn't start out as the maybe nicer versions that you get of the Muslim Brotherhood in other places where those people chose politics as opposed to just the gun. There were elements within Hamas that maybe would have talked about were more moderate, but Yahya Sinwar was not one of those elements. He was involved in killing Palestinian, what they called collaborators, back in the 80s. I mean, this is a ruthless, brutal man who is kind of like, if anyone's seen that scene in The Godfather with Luca Brasi when they kill him and choke him out and murder him, this was the kind of stuff that Yahya Sinwar was doing. He was using his own hands. He's the worst type of person. And anyway, be that as it may, in 2005, prior to this engagement, I went to Gaza, and we were staying near Khan Yunis, and we could hear the shooting all night. I guess it was the area we were in had IDF patrols around it, and they had concrete walls, as we all became used to in certain places, against sniper fire and things like that. But there was conflict all night long. And not long after that, then the communities were dismantled, and there was disengagement. And everyone thought at the time, I mean, I myself was probably one of the people that was naive enough to think, well, you know what, you take people out, that's the conflict, it'll stop. They just want land, they want two states, we leave, the PLO will come in, the Europeans will be at the border. You remember there was this European concept called UBAM. They were supposed to be down at the border, they were going to check the border, everything will be great. It really was just great. And I remember even there was funding to buy the Jewish greenhouses, funding from America to buy the greenhouses because the Palestinians need an economy and it will become the Singapore of the Middle East. This is what we were told. And I believed it, lots of people believed it. And very, very soon the rocket fire began. I was in 2008 and 9, I was in Sderot. I was a volunteer then with an organization called Lev Echad. We used to go down there to help people patch up their apartments or whatever. And there was no Iron Dome then, so when you had a rocket siren, the directive was find something that's between you and Gaza and get down beneath it. So whenever you were walking in the city, you kind of had to reorient yourself. Well, where is Gaza's over there? There's okay, I'll get behind this thing. Wasn't much you could do. And I remember being crouched down under the sirens and just thinking, you know, if this is the way it's going to end, just sitting here like there's no protection, nothing to do. You just hope something doesn't land near you. And then there were shells or this short-range rockets that landed near us. It was not a nice feeling. And then there was a war. And then there was 2012 and 2014. And then we had, if you remember, 2 years ago in 2021, there was the 10-day war with Hamas. And if you recall that time, if you were keyed into this a little bit, you remember they fired like 100 or salvos of like 150 rockets. They were trying to overwhelm Iron Dome. And I remember writing an article back then and saying, you know what, this looks like a dry run for something worse. This is the Iranian plan in action, because it was. Iran backs Hamas. Iran pays salaries. Iran traffics weapons. The long-range rockets that Hamas uses are all Iranian blueprints. It's a lot of Iranian know-how. Iran is happy to sacrifice people in Gaza and sacrifice Hamas, but they are a bit of the brains behind this operation, which is combined with the bloodthirstiness of someone like Sinwar. Anyway, I remember in 2021 there was an inkling that this could get worse, but you know, we had a very high-tech fence and everything worked, and it seemed like it would be okay. And then came October 7th. I had just come back from America. I was moving a bunch of my mom's stuff. My mom had passed away a few years ago. I had to move it from a storage into another storage. So I was in the States moving things. I came back October 6th almost. And that was a Friday. And, you know, Friday is a nice day. No work the next day. So I'd have a few drinks. I stayed up till 1, 2 in the morning watching some TV or something. And I thought, okay, I'll sleep in the next day at Simchat Torah. I'm not really religious, so I wasn't going to go to shul. But I thought, okay, it'd be a great day to sleep in. And I was woken at 8:20 or so in the morning by one of my kids shaking me, saying, there's sirens, there's sirens, there's sirens. And I said, but sirens? It's Jerusalem. Why would there be sirens in Jerusalem? There are sirens here. Even in the wars, we usually only had like 1 or 2. And then I could hear them, that weird harrowing sound that you never stop hearing if you've heard it. So I went to the balcony, and I have a very nice balcony in Gilo, which faces towards the West Bank and then towards Gaza. And which is usually great, but in this case, it faces Gaza. So the rockets were coming from there, and there was interceptions over our head, which of course caused the kids to run to the safe room, and of course caused me to take out my camera and film things, because I thought, well, this will be interesting. Because I'm a journalist and also one of those people that just probably doesn't obey any of the guidelines. But,
not West Bank.
Yeah. What? Yes, Judea and Samaria, of course. So I went down to Gaza border the first day of the war. I went down at 3 o'clock. We went down to Yad Mordechai. And this is in the book, so I'm just telling stories that are there as well. I got down there and remember that it was kind of almost getting to be sunset. And if you've been on that road, the road from Ashkelon goes to Yad Mordechai, and it goes directly into Gaza through Erez. It used to be the old road that people would use. Of course, now there's a big crossing. There's a turn off to Sderot. And I thought, okay, I'll get down here and see what's happening. Because in past wars, that was always an area, there was action, there was tanks and things, and there was things happening. When I got there wasn't much happening. There was a police cordon, there was army vehicles going in. We didn't understand at the time how chaotic it was, and how the reason not much was happening was because the state had kind of evaporated and was unable to respond for the first 12 hours of the war. And I learned subsequently many little stories about that are in the book, about some of the heroism of different people. But I remember the first inkling I got of how bad this was going to be was that there was a car that was all smashed up and shot up that was stuck on the curb, and it had bullet holes in it when I went up to it, and that's not good. And then there was what looked like a sack or a sleeping bag next to it. and it was a dead body. A body, they put some sort of a bag over the body, but no one had bothered to move the body. And this was not for lack of medical personnel, because there were ambulances going back and forth all the time. Because this was thought to be a terrorist, and he was dead. So they were only taking out people that were wounded. There was no time to deal with dead bodies. And the next day, I saw worse. I mean, we went into the same area, and we saw much more of similar scenes. And it was just clear, you know, that just utter devastation, and the fact that thousands of people had poured in from Gaza to murder and kill, and some of those people, those looters and terrorists have been killed and then been left there, eventually to be cleaned up. So the book is divided into 3 parts. It's a bit of my own stories, but it's it tries to give a sense. I wanted to write a book that's similar to what you read about any other disaster like this. Is a bit different, but like 9/11 or Pearl Harbor or something. It's a military disaster. It's also a human disaster. But I wanted to be about that day. Well, how do you write a book about a day? You could spend the whole book about one day. But I had so much background about writing about Hamas and Iran, and so I wanted it to be a third of the book, or a little bit less, to be about how we got here. This kind of drumbeat, this slow drumbeat from 30 years ago that leads up to this in terms of Hamas and us. How did the IDF get here? How did the IDF make mistakes? If they made mistakes, what were the mistakes? And what kind of commanders responded and who responded, and get a sense of that. And I covered the IDF. I knew a lot about technology and drones and stuff, so I thought I knew a lot about it. So it's kind of, that part is the beginning part, and then there's a whole section of the book that's just about the first day, the first hour of the war, the first week, as Israel kind of recovered a little bit by bit from this and tried to understand what had happened. I think many of us just forget how long it took just to know how many people were missing, how many people were kidnapped, who was a casualty. I mean, it took a very long time. Remember the first day, we never understood the extent of what had happened for days. We only now, in retrospect, we commemorate October 7th as the day, but in fact, it went on and on. I mean, there were people in safe rooms hiding sometimes for more than 2 or 3 days. I had friends of mine in Sderot. As you may have known, that in Sderot, the city was attacked, and the police station had to be destroyed because the terrorists got into the station, and they couldn't get them out, and they ended up destroying the entire police station to eliminate them. And the people of Sderot were kept at home for several days under curfew. And they were only able to go out and get a few essential things after the second or third day, and then they were all evacuated, the whole city. And I remember going there just after that, and the president had come down, and there was a temporary police station. He came to give a short talk. So that second section of the book is a bit about that, and then the third section is the experience I had, and not just myself, but interviewing. I think I interviewed more than half the Israeli IDF units that fought in Gaza, maybe 75% of them. That means I interviewed people from the paratroopers, the commando brigade, the 7th Armored, I mean every division that fought, and every type. I went out on naval boats, I covered the Navy, I spent time with drone operators, I spent time in strike cells, I was in Gaza. So I felt that as I saw all that, it should be a book. And that, we'll get back and then I'll finish this, because that's why I understood there had to be a book here, because I felt that there was a background here. I'm a historian in some ways by trade. I'm also a journalist, so I felt that I had the history, and I felt that telling the story of how this happened in a blow-by-blow account was important, to kind of give people an umbrella view of being able to step back, but also see it up close from the people that were there, not just myself, but people I interviewed, some of the first responders or soldiers or others, so that you could see it through their eyes and how it unfolded. And then to give people a sense of the first 6 months of the war. How did Israel respond? How did it pick itself up? What did people suffer that had to be evacuated? How did the army prepare to go back into Gaza? I mean, it's not well known, but the IDF didn't think they will ever really have to operate heavily in Gaza again. If anything, they thought they'd do what they did in 2014, which is some raids. They didn't think, no one thought, apparently. What will you do if you have to take back this whole thing? Apparently that was not thought about, and therefore the plans that we saw in Gaza were kind of plans from 2009. If you all remember, when Gilad Shalit was kidnapped. And there was a very short operation, I think, called Summer Rains, which was then very quickly eclipsed because there was the kidnapping in the north in the 2006 war. And we are now also refighting that a bit as well. So, and I should say it's not just about Gaza. I think that this war was the first shot in a much larger conflict. I want to say that I would compare it to the killing of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was killed at the beginning of the First World War. This was the first shot in a war that is for the world order, the West against anti-Western forces, which include China and Russia, who have supported Hamas. Make no mistake, this is not 1995 or 2005, when China and Russia probably would have condemned this. They have not condemned October 7th. Turkey supports Hamas openly. I know we had reconciliation with Erdogan a few years ago, but this is not a fact today. They support Hamas. Hamas is hosted by Doha in Qatar, which is a U.S. Non-NATO ally, whatever that means. I don't know why they're hosting Hamas. So this is not just Iran against Israel. It's a whole world order. It's a fight that includes what's happening in the Pacific, what's happening in Ukraine. It really is about what our way of life will be in this rest of the century, and we should understand it as a war on Israel. We are Israel. As a war on the Jewish people, and it's a genocidal war against us. But we are still fighting a much larger conflict, and these ballistic missiles that are flying over our roofs, and the fight in Lebanon, and the fact that we have Iraqi drones flying at our country, and Yemenite missiles, which no one would have imagined. What is a Houthis? Who would have heard of them a few years ago? I mean, unless you were some regional expert paying attention to this. So I think that it's important to understand October 7th in that light. That it is set in motion a whole series of terrible things. And again, I said at the beginning, we are maybe at the end of the beginning. And unfortunately, it's not good. It's not all good news, but I do think in the book there is a lot of good news. There's a lot of stories of heroism. There's a lot of stories of heroes and people who left their villages. I interviewed one guy who was a Druze soldier. He's a deputy commander of the 7th Armored Brigade, Hativat Sheva. He woke up that morning, just like we all did, and he saw on Telegram the images, and he didn't bother to ask questions. He got in his army jeep, because he was a deputy commander, I guess you get a jeep then, and he grabbed his rifle, and he started calling guys from the brigade. He drove all the way south, from Julis in the north. This takes about 2 hours. Probably on a Saturday you can do it, about 2 hours. I mean, there's no one on the roads. And he collected men as he got there. He's a tank commander, but he didn't have a tank. He got to an area near the Black Arrow site, which is near the Gaza Strip, if you've been there, not far from Kfar Aza. They encountered terrorists there, they fought them, and they were then told to pull out and go down to fight in Kibbutz Be'eri. He got to Be'eri, and they went in, they rescued people. He estimates they rescued 80 people, with other units, not just him. I mean, they had guys from Shayetet and also the units that were fighting. And they were got in a firefight on a street. Now it's at night by this time, the whole day's gone by, so he's fighting at night. It's probably around 11 or midnight, and he gets in a firefight, and he gets wounded. And he was wounded. He couldn't feel where it was because he's wearing his technical vest and everything. He didn't know he just knew something's wrong. But he didn't want the men that were with him to have to help him get out because he figured that would weaken the unit. And there weren't very many people. There weren't very many of them fighting these terrorists. So he sat down with his rifle next to a wall, and he tried to warn off the enemy until a tank appeared. And he realized that as a tank commander, the tank couldn't see him because it was coming down the street. And so at this point, he said, I got to tell someone I'm wounded. They got to get me out of here. So he told someone. They tried to pull him up the street. And they brought him to the collection point where there was an ambulance. And the ambulance drove him back to another collection point where there was a helicopter. The ambulance was shot at on the road. And they got through that. They got to the helicopter. They helicoptered him to Hadassah in Karen. I mean, he told me his story 6 months later. He said, I got there. They were wheeling me to the operating room, and he said, I need a phone. I don't have my phone with me. I've lost it. The doctor said, I don't have time to give you a phone. I've got to operate on you. You could die. He said, you got to give me your phone. You're not taking me anywhere. I'm calling my father to tell him where I am and my wife. They don't know where I am. All they know is I got up at 6:45 in the morning and disappeared. They have no idea where I've been all day. I haven't been in touch with them. They need to know that this is the hospital I'm at. If I die, at least they know where I am. So the guy said, fine, quickly, send the message, whatever. And he survived. I saw him 6 months later. He was going back into Gaza. He'd just been rehabilitated. So that's the caliber of people that are defending this country.
Thank you very much, Seth. Okay, I'd like to welcome Frantzman, the State of Israel's Special Envoy for Trade and Innovation. Previously served as Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem in charge of foreign relations, international economic development and tourism. She's also co-founder of the UAE Israel Business Council, an association of Emirati and Israeli business and government leaders fostering bilateral trade, innovation and cooperation. She was born in London and grew up in Gibraltar. She studied law at King's College London, where she qualified as a barrister and made Aliyah to Israel in 2001.
Okay, I'm going to sit and just talk to Seth because it's much more fun. Okay, thank you so much. So thank you so much, Paul. Thank you to the Begin Center for holding this event. Seth and I have been friends since Abraham Accords days. And so we're in a very, very different place, Seth. We actually became friends in Dubai in 2020, and look where we are right now. So you mentioned a little bit in your address about the different parts of the book, but I think I want to ask you what a lot of us have on our minds and which hasn't left our minds. And I know that we have a limited amount of time, but maybe just main points or broad strokes. How on earth did we get here? What happened? How many failures had to happen for the attack to happen, for the border to be breached, for the military bases to be decimated, and for the army not to get there for hours and hours and hours? And I do know there's a lot of heroism for the people that did show up on time, but it was not what any of us thought the Israeli army was capable of. We're a strong army. Nothing happens. In this country, an ambulance comes in 60 seconds. How on earth did this happen?
Well, thank you so much for coming in. I really appreciate. I mean, we have known each other for a long time, and we did a lot of different. We've been in a lot of different other places, and we're happy at times. That is obviously the key question, and I think that will have to be researched for a very long time, I suppose. But what I've learned is, I mean, or I guess in terms of the broad brush strokes and some of the little things. I mean, it's the phenomenon of the bigger you are, the harder you fall, in a sense. I mean, Israel is this high-tech state. It's a startup nation. It's a $1 trillion economy and what have you. It's an extraordinary place. It's extraordinary place. Extraordinary. And but look, you know, this country's full of lots of smart people, but you know, lots of smart people can make the wrong decisions also. And this country, unfortunately, had incredible complacency and arrogance prior to October 7th. We all thought that these amazing high-tech fences and all these brilliant people from Shmoni Matayim or 8200, these different units, that it's some sort of magic wand. And if you have Iron Dome, it's great. And the thing is, we've all learned now, you know, Iron Dome and air defenses and all sorts of cool things, they're not a substitute for strategy, and they're not a substitute for underestimating or overestimating your enemies. And unfortunately, we definitely underestimated Hamas, and that's why I gave that little story about Mr. Sinwar. You know, this is a guy we, Israel, let out of prison.
Well, before that, we saved his life by operating in his cancerous tumor.
Right. So that probably was, we probably should not have let him out of prison. I hope we've learned that lesson. I think, again, it's a question of, the Hamas was very smart. Let's remember that, you know, when it comes to contact with the enemy gets a say as well. It's not just us. The enemy, how did they deceive us? They openly trained every day for war until we got used to it. They did this great march of return where they sent people to the fence to ostensibly throw stones, but in fact to monitor our response. And we got used to it, and we became complacent, and we didn't have enough troops on the border. And it's much like the complacency in 1973 in the Yom Kippur War. Of all the signs were there, but every single person looking at them generally graded them as the wrong way, which is, it's not such a big deal. Unfortunately, I think, you know, we've now learned this the worst way possible. I don't think we'll underestimate them again, I hope. But we will find that in the way the system broke down is extraordinary, because we expect, of course, that we can call the army or the police and they'll show up.
Yeah.
We expect that there will be people there to protect us and that you're safe from won't become the place that you wait for 12 hours to be burned to death or something like that. I mean, so we have to relearn a little bit of what the early Zionists and the pioneers did. Who are the people that built this country, and what are the battles of Tel Hai and all the stories you hear about the 1890s, 1920s, or 1930s? What was going on back then? I mean, these were people who came out of many of whom came out of Eastern Europe or suffered pogroms or whatever, and they built the Haganah's self-defense forces against much stronger enemies. And these enemies were also illiterate and simplistic in some ways. But they certainly didn't underestimate them, and I think that's what our history teaches us, and I assume we'll have to get back to some of those basics. If we don't, and we don't learn these lessons, and we just keep trudging on without thinking about, you know, what's going on here in the broader strategic issues, then we may run into this again, and may be surprised again, by the way, by groups like the Houthis and the Iraqis, which lots of people, I think, mocked for a while.
I think we definitely mocked, but I think you're 100% right about the fact that we got used to certain things. We also got used to a war every year, ostensibly, with Gaza. And I mean, for our involvement in Jerusalem, of course, is that they would always use Ramadan as an excuse. So one of the Fridays of Ramadan, maybe the second Friday of Ramadan, what would happen is that a bunch of hooligans would go up onto Temple Mount on Thursday night, they'd lock themselves in, they'd desecrate their own mosque, they'd play football, they would take firecrackers and huge boulders, and then the next day the army had to go up, and then in the whole Muslim world they would say, oh, the Jews are storming Temple Mount, they're going to kick us out of Temple Mount, and then Hamas would throw a rocket, call it Al-Aqsa, all the wars are called Alaska, surprise, surprise, and then they would say, well, look, you're storming Temple Mount, that was the excuse. And that happened every single year, from 5 years, 6 years, every single time. And I think that what you're saying is correct. I think we got used to this kind of low-grade conflict. We developed a tolerance and a threshold, and we underestimated the enemy, and there was confirmation bias. Everybody was focused on the north, everybody was focused on Iran and their nuclear capabilities, and, you know, the paying protection money to Hamas through Qatar, and we thought their values, maybe to a certain extent, were our values. As long as you can pay them off, and they have some type of, you know, some type of economic something, or they're getting money into their pockets, they're going to be fine. But my question is, and I 100% agree with you, that this is part of a huge war. How much is this now, I'm going to get political for a second, dependent on what happens on November 5th in the American election?
I mean, I guess it's $1 million question.
I'm not going to ask you who's going to win.
I mean, the more interesting question, obviously, what that hints at, I think, is whether or not, you know, had there been a different U.S. administration on October 7th,
would it have happened at all?
Would Hamas have thought that they get away with this? And it's not just Hamas. I mean, Hamas is a genocide organization. The leopard does not change its spots. But who is hosting Hamas? And that is Qatar and Doha. And who is backing Hamas? That's Putin and Beijing quietly, and also Erdogan in Turkey and others. And those, you know, those regimes, you know, had friends in Washington in this administration and the last administration. So it's not that Doha suddenly is more cozy with the Biden administration. It's not true. They had friends in the Trump administration. But would they have told Hamas, you better not mess around? Or would Hamas have not had seen the American withdrawal from Afghanistan and also seen the war in Ukraine and thought, well, you know what, the West is weak, and let's talk to our Russian friends. And they say, yeah, we don't really care if you massacre a bunch of Jews, because we're fighting Ukraine, it'll be a great distraction. I mean, let's make no mistake, Hamas has been hosted by the Russians afterward. They've gone there. The Chinese hosted 14 Palestinian factions in the wake of October 7th. So this is a very clear, as I mentioned, kind of world order. But I would never, I think it's not good to make predictions. We don't ever really know what will happen. I mean, during the Trump administration, there was also chaos. I remember the withdrawal from Syria, as someone who spent some time in Iraq with the Kurdish people. That was not a helpful decision, I don't think, and it did lead to chaos. So we have to wonder. There's going to be an election. Someone's going to win. But at the end of the day, we can't get up in the morning and decide every day what happens in Washington is what's going to decide the fate here. Because otherwise, we could just close it up. And, you know.
Do you think that's part of the process of our sort of independence, that in this war we've realized, I mean, it's happened before in our different wars, we have to maybe wean ourselves off of that type of dependence on the United States?
I don't think, I think we have to understand how the dependence works. It's complicated. It's not just that we get things from them. This isn't the 1950s or 60s when we really needed rifles from the Czech Republic, or we needed French support for things. I mean, Israel is an economic behemoth, and it's also an industrial military behemoth. It has three major arms industries, Rafael, Elbit Systems, and II. We make the systems that are helping armies throughout the world. So it's not just that they're dependent on us. The United States provides a lot of money. That money basically buys F-35, so it's basically money that goes back to America. They want us to buy F-35s. It's not that they don't want that to happen. That helps the American arms industry, and also it helps America because the United States Central Command partners with Israel, and they get to see if these weapons work. I mean, when Iron Dome works,
with a laboratory, like with COVID.
Unfortunately, that's the case with Israel. We were a laboratory in the 70s as well. I mean, this country was getting Hawk missiles, and how did we bomb Osirak in 82? Well, what aircraft did we use? Didn't we use F-16s or F-15? Anyway, we got a bunch of aircraft that were supposed to go to the Shah of Iran, right? And there was an Islamic Revolution,
yes.
And then we got the aircraft. And the Americans, I'm sure, were happy as clams to see that they worked to go all the way to Iraq and bomb a nuclear reactor. I mean, at the time, I'm sure they criticized us, but I mean, in the end of the day, that's that this country has had this relationship. It's not just, I guess I'm saying, this isn't South Vietnam. It's not 100% dependent on American arms. It's a relationship that goes both ways. But we have to be careful always, I guess, to make sure we define ourselves in terms of what our goals are and not let this become the story we're even seeing play out this week, where it's like, can we have permission to bomb Iran? I mean, when we bombed Osirak, right, they didn't tell Washington, they just went and did it. So
I think we've been doing a lot of that recently as well in Lebanon.
Yes, and I think that's why we're seeing it work, right? The pagers, which Israel doesn't take responsibility for.
No, of course not.
They just exploded. Pagers are dangerous. That's why I don't carry them.
Pagers are for drug dealers and terrorists, let's be honest. Okay.
The pagers thing, and then there was the killing in Nasrallah and the commanders. I mean, it's going very well. Israel took the gloves off, and we can see what Israel's capable of when it wants to be capable. What we see in Gaza, that Israel is a bit reticent to end things there and what to do next. So
why?
Why? Because I think we don't know what the final end goal strategy is. And I think that even though early in the war we talked about there won't be Hamas. Remember there was some statement, Lo Yahyeh Hamas, but then it became, well, we'll kind of defeat them, we'll defeat the capabilities. Because I think there's not a clear answer as to what you do if you get rid of Hamas, let's say. Like what goes there? Something's going to go there.
Well,
so,
the Palestinian Authority are completely incapable of ruling even their own territories. So bringing them in is not going to help. Do you ever, my little dream is, and this is where we go back to the good old days of the Abraham Accords, my little dream was that perhaps through an agreement that America has with Saudi Arabia for a defense pact that then includes Israel, that somehow we could convince the Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia to take over Gaza. I mean, the Gazans should be thrilled by this prospect and turn it into Dubai. Am I dreaming here?
Yes.
I mean, look.
Let's let the expert answer.
The crowd didn't say yes.
It's a nice dream. They already had the chance.
I think if we were in different circumstances, it's plausible things like that could happen. But I think the problem is, we forget that what is the Hamas agenda and what are those who back Hamas, whether it's Qatar or Russia or China or others, what do they want? And I mean, let's remember that in 2017 there was a Gulf crisis with Qatar and the rest of those countries you mentioned, Saudi Arabia and UAE.
Yeah.
So I don't think they would want these countries in there, and therefore they'll tell Hamas to hang on to the last Gazan and to not have that happen. So I think that the world we live in, because it's not the 90s, it's like we don't live in a world where anyone is interested generally in peace and prosperity. I mean, I think this, unfortunately, the world we see is one that's trending towards more and more wars. So there's too many people benefit from that conflict going on.
For sure.
For the Saudis, the UAE to take the risks involved. And let's not forget, the Chinese have brokered Saudi-Iranian reconciliation. That's not good for us.
Yeah.
It's definitely not good for us, but I think that a part of it is very much for shock, because the Saudis, let's not forget, and again, I always try and look at the glass half full, even though it's been a difficult year of finding it. The Saudis were helping us back in April when the Iranians attacked, but even more than they were helping us, they admitted that they helped us. The Emiratis, the same thing. They do understand that Shia homogeny is the last thing they want. They have gotten rid of their Muslim Brotherhood issues. The Saudis have gotten rid of the Wahhabis in their country, more or less, or at least getting... They understand political Islam is a problem, which is exactly the definition of what's going on in Iran. The Iranian people don't want the regime. I mean, Seth, let's look at the positive prospects here. Could this be the end of the Islamic Republic of Iran?
Well, that would be the great rabbit to pull out of the hat, which is that actually we're looking at this region in which Iran looks extremely strong, and Israel appears to be surrounded in some ways on all sides by the I would even say eight-front war, because we're seeing more attacks now inside Israel by citizens of Israel. If the Iranian regime imploded or fell apart, or that would be obviously ideal, and it would take the wind out of all this million terrible things that we're fighting. And look, Israel has decimated 1.5 with Iranian proxies. Hamas is pretty badly beaten, 80% and whatever. And Hezbollah is not doing great. But we don't want to be sucked into a long, endless quagmire, because that's what they want. They are under the impression that if we get sucked into two-front wars, that they can chip away at us slowly with 1,000 paper cuts.
Yeah.
And that's where they are, I think.
And so, what would happen? Can Israel, I mean, I'm part of this think tank, NSGAV, think tank for national security. And I asked Meir Ben Shabbat, who used to be the head of the National Security Council, could we take on Iran on our own? He said no. What are we going to do with Iran if America is only interested at the moment in defense and not help us with offense?
I mean, it's a question. I mean, I'd be interested to understand what parts of the Iranian regime we can't defeat, because Iran doesn't have much of a navy. It has just a few ships.
They don't have an air force either, right?
They have an air force that was built in the 1950s and 60s. It's primarily old American planes. I mean, they're like F-4s. It's stuff that was flown in Vietnam.
Is this the helicopter is this part of the helicopter that downed?
It may have been a Bell helicopter, I'm not sure, but it didn't work. I mean, in fog. No, look, the Iranians don't have an air force. They don't have a navy. The Iranian army is perfectly big, and it fought the Iraqis well in the 80s. But Israel's not going to march all the way over and fight them in a land war.
We're not going to fight them in a land war, but can we just bomb strategic energy facilities, or could we even get rid of, or at least paralyze part of their nuclear program on our own without America?
I think we could do a lot of it on our own. I'm sure there's the aspects of intelligence sharing and use of satellites and all sorts of certain technology that are may need the United States, of course. And that's why Israel's, of course, still trying to buy new refuelers so we can refuel aircraft. When we have some, but we need new ones because we waited too long. But Israel can do a lot of damage to the Iranian regime. But I'm sure also there is the hint, the Iranians have hinted that they will strike back at the Gulf. That if we attack something in Iran that's substantially large enough, like an oil facility or whatever, that they'll just attack the Gulf oil facilities. And let's not forget, Saddam Hussein did that exactly. Remember when he set the oil fields on fire? I mean, Iranians are not stupid. This is an incredibly smart regime, far smarter than Saddam regime.
Yeah.
It's an incredibly smart and evil regime, but it knows exactly the pressure points of the West. And at the East, it knows the pressure points of the Saudis and the UAE, and they understand that those countries are deathly afraid of what the Iranians could do. They know that the Saudis were fought to a stalemate against the Houthis. I mean, so they understand the cards they can play.
And now, you said we're at the end of the beginning.
Yes. Yeah.
What is the end? Where do we go from here? And does the West, or the liberal world, or the free world, or the democratic world, whatever you want to call it, when do they wake up and join the civilizational clash that we will have now as the world had in the 1930s? When does that happen? Or does it happen at all?
Well, I made a point about that this conflict I felt had some similarities in terms of I said it like the killing of Franz Ferdinand. And I said that, and if you were to draw the conclusion from that, you'd say, well, wait, is Israel the Serbs in that equation, or is Israel the Austro-Hungarian Empire? Unfortunately, as anyone I guess here is a World War I fan or is interested in it, you probably cannot recall almost any or very few battles from the front line of that front, of the Austro-Hungarian Serbian front, or even the so-called White War it was fought in the Alps or whatever, in the Dolomites, between the Austro-Hungarians and the Italians. Most people don't even remember that part of the war. So let's say that we're that part of the war. We're this world order, but we're the part that people don't want to know that much about. And I think in the West we see that. There's a fatigue for the Middle East. People just roll their eyes when they talk about the Middle East. I mean, there's people that hate Israel and they're obsessed with it, and there's people that love us and they're obsessed with it. But there's a lot of people that are just like, oh, not another Middle Eastern war. I can't take that anymore. I mean, so there's a lot of fatigue in the West, and I think that's natural because there's a lot of Western countries got burned here. I mean,
and they've also been, they started already 2 years before with the Russian-Ukrainian war, so they were already warred out.
They are, and that makes sense. So I think when you say, will they jump on board with the civilizational aspects of this war, there's certainly lots of voices we hear in the West that see it that way. There's some that don't. I think at the end of the day, we may have to fight in our own little sector here, not always on our own, but with some limited partnerships, and just expect that in the end of the day, the West, other countries will be focused on Russia and focused on China, and we will be seen as a bit of the third front or the backwater or whatever, and it's not great for us, but it's not the worst thing for us. Because I'll say this, we mentioned how these previous wars in Lebanon and stuff, back in the day when Israel invaded Lebanon, it was never our fault, of course, in 82 or 2006 we were being attacked. But let's remember how those wars in 2006 ended. We were forced into a ceasefire, and the Hezbollah was supposed to leave the border, and they didn't. I mean,
the UN resolution that nobody ever bothered to implement, and they got stronger, and they went south of the Lithuania, and now here we are.
Well, good. So when did the war in Lebanon, Northern Arrows start? Does anyone remember? September 23rd, right? I think. 23rd? Yeah, okay. It's already like 2 weeks of the war. The war in 2006 only lasted a month. In 2 weeks, let's say in 2 weeks Lebanon war will be over. We won't have achieved our goals by then. So it's kind of good that the West is kind of tired and fatigued. Because maybe they'll let us accomplish what we need to.
Finish off the war.
Yeah, well that's right. So I think in 2006 we got like 10% of our goals or something. I think this, now Israel's talking tough about really accomplishing things. Now, can they do it? I hope so. But as I said, we saw in Gaza, we're good at getting to the 90th, yard line or whatever. Sometimes it's hard to get to the goal line. So we wonder.
So Seth, as a journalist, I want to talk about one of the fronts that we didn't talk about yet, and that is the communications war.
Yes.
That you're in the front lines of, I'm in the front lines of, but it's a war nevertheless. So my theory is that for the first time, and maybe I'm wrong, for the first time the communications war that we're losing, because we've never invested in it, we've never strategized about it. The government, the Prime Minister doesn't have a spokesperson, they don't have a head of the public diplomacy directorate. We are completely without any type of soldiers in the communications war, except for the good people who decide to do it. My question is, I believe that for the first time in this war, the communications war that we seemingly are losing is affecting our military war. The fact that the Biden administration pressurized us not to go into Rafah when we should have gone in January or February, and we waited around till March or April, is because of public opinion. You are a journalist. Is there anything we can do, or is it just me ranting on about how bad the government is at Hezbollah?
No, I think there's a lot we can do. I think, one thing we learned about the West in general is that they'll catch on to these slogans like "all eyes on Rafah," and remember the Akleh hospital when the Hamas attacked it by mistake, and then they blamed us.
They blamed us, and then we went from 500 dead to 6 dead it was then.
I think we have to keep playing our game, and I think that means staying on message about Hamas. I mean, these messages are truthful messages. That's why it's good and easy to stay on them. But Hamas hides in schools. Hamas hides in hospitals. Hamas uses human shields. Hamas dresses as civilians. Hezbollah is hiding under villages. Hezbollah is digging tunnels under Christian villages. Hezbollah has destroyed Lebanon. Hezbollah is illegally storing weapons a few hundred meters from an international airport. I mean, it's not, these are true, these are facts. The facts are on our side. The more that we see what's going on, I think people start to think, well, you're right, why is Hezbollah have missiles? When they see an explosion in Beirut, and there's obviously all these secondary explosions, they wonder, like, well, wait a second, maybe the Israelis aren't something. I think that we have to stick with our message because it is true, because we're not making it up. The enemy will continue to make things up about all these casualties they have, or all the civilians, or what have you, that we've supposedly killed. They're generally wrong, and I think, look, there's a group of people in the West that hate us. There's a group around those people that kind of don't like us and are easily influenced by the bad group. Then there's a whole big fat part around that is actually, I think, generally can be open to us, but their friends tell them Israel's bad, and they kind of say that to go along, to get along, like everyone in the West that says, like, you know, do all sorts of things to kind of pose, like, we are all familiar with things where people kind of pretend to be into something that they're actually not into. So. Yeah. And that's okay. Let them say, yeah, Israel's bad, but actually they go home and they're like, yeah, Israel's great. I mean, and there's lots of people like that.
I completely agree. I get a lot of messages from people like that every single day. So, Seth, last question before we open this up to audience questions. Where are we a year from now?
I think a year. Unfortunately, I think a year from now, you know, we may have finished things hopefully in Lebanon, and Hezbollah will be badly defeated. I think that Hamas, unfortunately, may remain in many parts of Gaza unless we're willing to completely replace them, and we don't see that way to do that. I think the Houthis, you know, we won't be able to degrade their capabilities much. I don't think the Iraqi militias will change much. I think it's a big question mark, you know, if we're willing to carry out real strikes on Iran, if we get involved in some sort of thing where ballistic missiles become a new norm here. And that would be not great for us unless we can unsettle the regime and weaken it. So that is, I guess, a big question mark. But I think, unfortunately, we're in for a very, very, very long war, and I think it will dominate a bit of our lives here. And there is no easy fix. And you mentioned COVID or something before, someone did. That was a long thing that people were saying, oh, 2 weeks to slow the spread or whatever. And it's like, no, it's not 2 weeks. It's 2 years to slow the spread. Unfortunately, just buckle up and wait.
I think we got used to short wars, and I think that the miscalculation that Hamas and Hezbollah made was that we didn't have the stomach for long wars, that we were having too much of a nice time.
That's right.
And that we didn't really have, and our young people wouldn't have had the stomach. Boy, were they wrong. Okay, thank you, Seth. That was amazing. Question.
You keep mentioning Hamas, but when I read, and hear and listen, it's not just Hamas in Gaza. Who is there to speak to that is not pro-Hamas there? If there is somebody, and I remember at one time they killed him. So who do we have to deal with? And when we talk about thinking like the West and the East, we think differently. I like to think that there's a mother there that thinks the way I do. But then I say, I don't know that's true.
No, I think that unfortunately, you know, Hamas has run Gaza since 2007 when they did the coup. I mean, obviously they were running parts of it before that, but that means anyone who was born like around the year 2000, 2003, all they know is Hamas. So it's very hard. It's not just hard. It's hard to get to them. And I think, you know, you mentioned there's probably plenty of people in Gaza who do not like what Hamas has done to them, but they also see the fact that people that oppose Hamas get dragged to the streets. And I think that doesn't seem to be a Fatah or clan-based leadership that's ready to pick its head up. And again, I don't think Israel really wants to talk to Fatah and get in bed with that leadership. So I think there's also that aspect of it. It's not like, it's not the 1990s. If it was, you know, there might be a way in which someone would have that kind of discussion like Israel used to do in Madrid or whatever. But there is no second secret track 2 talks taking place today. I mean, things have changed a lot. So I think, unfortunately, it will be very difficult to fill the Hamas shoes.
The fear is, yesterday Israeli media reported that Hamas and Fatah are meeting in order for Fatah to take over, like fake take over Gaza when Hamas is controlling them from behind. But I think that, I agree with Seth, at this point I don't think we're stupid enough to believe in this. Yes?
So Seth, in your opening remarks, one of the things you mentioned about October 7th was the disappearance of the government on October 7th, or something to that effect. Could you elaborate a little bit? Besides the IDF not functioning, you talked a little bit about the government not functioning on October 7th.
Yeah, I mean, this is the extraordinary thing that happened, which is that there was all the systems that people were used to were unable to function because they were just overwhelmed. And any system can become overwhelmed. And I'll tell you that it's not every part of the state that was like that. What's fascinating is, I remember going on to Barzillai Hospital in Ashkelon on the first and second days of the war, and the degree to which it was functioning fine. I mean, they'd taken lots of casualties there to be treated, and then they moved them on. But actually, the healthcare system in this country was phenomenal. Yeah. The healthcare companies and all the ambulances and all the volunteers. I interviewed a guy from one of the organizations like United Hatzalah, and he got up in the morning and got his ambulance with a doctor from Hebrew, and they just drove down there, and it was a harrowing, terrible day for him. He said he saw hundreds of dead bodies and badly wounded people, but the health, everything, a lot of things worked. A lot of things didn't work. The security forces in the army, I mean, on the battalion level and the lower level worked okay, when the people could show up eventually, but and special units, by the way, performed great. They suffered huge casualties. But the big army was not there because it wasn't based there. There were no tank divisions. There were no reserve tanks. There were only like a dozen tanks on the Gaza border. There was 2 helicopters on station that morning. There was no one to drive the tanks like this guy I told you about. I interviewed artillerymen who came from the north. They wanted to go, but the artillery has to be put on a truck to get there. There was no artillery to support the troops. I interviewed another tank commander, reserve officer, in the 401st. He was called up to the tanks that were on an emergency crew there in central Israel. They got to the tanks, and the commander said, listen, I think we should put you guys on a bus to go south, and you'll fight on foot as infantry. And he said, this is crazy. I'm a commander of a tank. Give me my tank. They're here for a reason. They're on emergency ready orders. I'll drive them to Gaza. And they drove them on a dirt road next to Kvish 6, so Route 6, until they got near Sderot, and then the tank crew split in half. 4 of the tanks went to Yad Mordechai, and 4, by this time it was midnight. The other ones went to fight in Sderot and in Be'eri in Faza. We know some of those stories. So, yeah, look, things broke down. The system was overwhelmed, and the top general staff were not there.
And I think that a lot of people were just shocked in the leadership. It just took them a while to react. That's what I think. Yes.
What I'm curious about is not so much how things happened that day, but when I read about the fact that, let's say, Netanyahu's government was sending suitcases full of money that was directed via Qatar to Hamas in Gaza. The conception and the strategy then was that they had a dream that this was going to mollify them and that they were not out to destroy us.
Protection money.
Is that the conception? Is that what people actually thought? We give them millions of dollars, which Netanyahu did.
Yeah, somehow Israel was bought into this ridiculous nonsense that if you just feed the crocodile enough, somehow it won't eat you. So we thought if we just give them money, and we all know why this came about. And we mentioned the Abraham Accords, and we at the time we spent in the Gulf. Israel was focused on a much bigger picture, the grand strategy.
Yeah.
And if you talk to people in the defense establishment, they would tell you, listen, 90% of our resources are going into defending Israel against the Iranian threat, the Iranian trafficking in Syria, and then the Hezbollah threat. Well, they talked about what they call the third circle, which is all this 3D chess, which is Israel has to deal with Iran first, and blah, blah. Look, Iran is the big enemy, but Iran backs Hamas. Iran has a pawn on our side of the board. Yeah. But we were like, no, that's fine. That pawn, we'll just ignore it. Let's go deal with something over here. And I think that unfortunately became the concept. How do you bribe that pawn not to get to the end of the board? Give them money, it's fine. But again, it's like a mafia. You pay protection money. Okay, you can run your shop. But is that really the model that you want to live in a city in which that happens? No, it's better to just get rid of the mafia and not have it. And I think we've learned the hard way, and I think that hopefully we will never do this again in terms of allowing Qatar, which is an enemy of the state of Israel, which hosts Hamas, How would you trust your enemy? It's mad. And I think historically, Zionist leadership never did that. Israel never trusted in its enemies. It was always very suspicious and asked questions, even if it was willing to do all sorts of weird devil's bargains and things like that. But it never trusted them.
Yeah.
We should never have trusted the Qataris, and we should never have trusted Hamas.
Why does America trust them?
Well, not only does America trust them, but they've just renewed the lease on the American base in Qatar. Instead of compensating one of the countries like the UAE or Bahrain for making peace with Israel, it's actually put its military base in Qatar because Qatar pays for it. So yeah, there's a lot of money interest involved, yes.
Thanks. Sorry, I just want to finish what you're saying. Wasn't the reason that we continued with Hamas is because we had our eye on building this alliance with Saudi Arabia, America and Israel? I thought.
Well, look, that's why I mentioned that. I just
that
think
wasn't my question.
No, but let's say you were Israel and your priority is keeping things quiet in Gaza in order to build the bigger picture,
yeah.
Which I think we all agree actually would be great if that could happen. But the thing is, you should always have someone in the room who says, okay, let's say Hamas is not deterred. Let's say they're willing to attack us tomorrow. What should we do? And so you keep an extra few infantry, brigades there, and that's fine.
Absolutely. Look, what my burning question is about this situation with Russia, China, Turkey, a Europe this alliance coming more and more together, which is anti-Israel, or let's say it's pro-Iran, on top of a very scared Europe, which already is starting to do these kind of restrictions on sending us arms, and a United States which just we don't really know what's going to happen there. I know it's not the same situation when you look at Tibet or Taiwan or all these other small places, Britain's just given back the Changi Islands. But when I look at Israel and the size of us, yes, I know we're militarily very powerful, but how do you see us surviving in this new world of these huge alliances?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I don't have all the answers. I mean, I think that Israel will have to find a way in this world. I think Israel flirted sometimes with the idea that the Russians and the Chinese actually could be partners in certain things.
We
learned that they're not, I guess.
We tried. I mean, there was a lot of it. When the Russia-Ukraine war started, Israel sat on the fence for quite a bit of time. Well, I think now that Russia's put their chips with Hamas, we're less on the fence than we were. But we did because we didn't want to get involved in a big war because we were trying to keep Russia happy. Putin came here, we opened up do you remember, monument in Jerusalem? I was there, the question is, for me the question is more, when is the West going to wake up? Because that's the answer to you. The answer is, yes, we have the evil alliance of evil, but we do have an alliance of good countries. When are they going to smell the coffee? That's my question.
Bigger and bigger Muslim votes, they're not going to smell it.
There are Americans that still believe the Democratic Party has something to do with democracy.
We'll see what happens. Greer and then somebody
Some of them are Jews.
I'm going to go back to the government on the premise that a single match can burn down a whole forest. Do you think that Itamar Ben-Gvir can cause all the countries that have in the region that have made peace with us, or at least learned to live with us, go in the direction of Iran?
Is Itamar Ben-Gvir what? But for going up on Temple Mount?
No, not just going
Just
up
by
on
being
the
himself?
on targeting Arabs for no reason whatsoever.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I don't want to open a debate on Itamar Ben-Gvir, but all I can say to you is, Greer, if we've survived the Abraham, I'll say a few things because like I said, I always try to be positive. I'm very impressed with how the Abraham Accords are sticking, and I'll tell you why. Not only what we saw in April, we saw it again last week when Iran attacked us. I have a lot of relationships in the Gulf. And there are some relationships that I've lost, and there are some things that have been strained. But there's a few spokespeople for the government of the UAE who are not official spokespeople, who are going around the world completely given the blessing to do so by the government of the UAE and Bahrain, saying this is not Israel's fault, Iran is behind this, and Iran is the enemy of any type of tolerance and pluralism as the free world. So however important people may think Itamar Ben-Gvir is, I actually don't think he's that important, and he's not going to bring down the Abraham Accords. That's just my humble opinion.
And what question?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. We've seen already this government has been in power since 2022, right? I mean,
23, yeah, 23.
No, I mean, I don't think that he or that type of politics is helpful to us in terms of the region at all. But again, as you just said, like, so far there is nothing is broken. The bow is not broken. So we'll see. I don't know. We just don't know what's going to happen here. Lots of bad things can happen, and I think that, we'll just have to see.
I just don't think one man can bring it down. And if 3 wars, since we made peace with these countries, we've had 3 wars now, if that hasn't brought it down,
It's not one man, it's one man with a party.
it's one man with a party who now can leave the government and be protected because he brought in Guido Sar.
Exactly. What about that?
Yeah.
I want to ask a nice question. How is it possible that from so many years all these tunnels were built in Gaza and that we just discover it now, that the head of the government, like, we are astonished to discover so many tunnels that are so dangerous now with the Mossad, the Shin Bet, all the crazy organization that defends Israel. How is it possible?
Great question. How did we not know that they had 700 kilometers? We knew?
No, we didn't know. We knew aspects of it, because let's remember in 2021, in the 10-day war, if you go back, you can Google it, IDF spokesman, ... Hamas has suffered serious setback in the attack on the metro system. Remember this metro system?
Yes.
That was a tunnel. So Israel tried using air power to demolish tunnels, and air power doesn't work very well, especially not in a dense urban environment, in which, at that time, by the way, we were very reticent to have any civilian casualties, so we were very careful. I think Israel knew there were tunnels. It didn't know there was 800 or 500 miles of them. Again, this is a huge failure of intelligence. And why did that failure happen? In part because the intelligence agencies all transitioned into this more high-tech digital world. And you know what they stopped using in Gaza, and to some extent, at least I've heard anecdotally, is human intelligence. Using local people. And by the way, if you go back a few years...
Well, my son-in-law is high up in intelligence, so yeah, that's no brainer.
No, I didn't say that they stopped them completely. They dialed it back. And by the way, if you Google the incident a few years ago, there was a Druze soldier who was working undercover in Gaza, and there was a firefight in Khan Yunis in which he was killed, monitoring a Hamas headquarters. And after that death, which was a serious incident, by the way, I think there was a lot of decisions taken. Let's take these people out. Let's be careful. And when you start to lose that human intelligence, you lose the tracking. But again, those human intelligence people weren't able to find all the tunnels in 2014. So the fact is, maybe we're just not good at finding tunnels, and we've got to get better at it.
With all the technology, you'd think that from the air, with some type of drone system, you could figure out that there were tunnels.
We're going to find a lot worse things than, I guess, in southern Lebanon's nature reserves.
Gentlemen over here.
Prior to October 7th, the perception was that we were as close to a civil war. And then October 7th came along and unified the country for a temporary period of time. Now, a year later, it almost appears we're back to square one. You're suggesting another year? Years.
Decades.
How resilient is our society with the situation?
Well, it's been 4,000 years and we're still here, so I think we're pretty resilient. Yes.
It was always the assumption that Iran did not have nuclear capabilities, but I've been reading about all of this underground testing going on in the last couple of days. What are we doing to mitigate that situation? Is it true? Is it rumor?
No, I don't know. All I know is that the story used to be enrichment. You all remember the stories of enrichment? Like, well, if Iran is 2 months from a bomb, and they have 3%, but they could have 80%, but they could have 90%. Yeah. Now, by the way, when's the last time you read an article about enrichment?
No.
You haven't, because now they have a massive amount of uranium sitting in rooms with huge amounts of enriched uranium. Now the problem is the weapons, the ballistic missiles. And by the way, we've seen ballistic missiles. They can get here. If you could get them here, you can put nuclear warheads on. It's not good, by the way. It's not good, the trend that this is going in. But I mean, Israel has always said the red line is weaponization. I mean, no, it used to say enrichment was, whatever. Yeah. Weaponization ostensibly is the red line, and then what? I don't know. I mean,
I mean, are we
I
almost
think
there?
we're close, but you all remember, you guys, who saw Oppenheimer here? Wait, that's it? Come on, who saw Barbie? Okay, if you saw Oppenheimer,
This is an Oppenheimer.
for those of us who did not see it, by the way, you remember that it took them a very long time to build the bomb, and they had people working all around America, Lawrence Livermore and this, and Oak Ridge and that, and then all around, thousands of scientists or whatever, remember they were sequestered, and for years, it took billions of dollars. The Iranians, by the way, have not done what America did. They don't have as many scientists, they have lots of locations, but they're actually nowhere near the size of the American program. And the Americans took them years. And by the way, once they built the thing, remember what they had to do? They had to put it on that pedestal, and they had to blow it up to see if it even worked. The Iranians haven't got to they haven't tested it. They're far enough away, but they will have weaponization soon. They will have the uranium. They won't test it. I mean, that's the question mark. I don't think they will for a while.
People didn't know what we were doing in Dimona either.
Exactly. It's like, well, we'll see.
But I heard there was an earthquake in Iran, and they
Yes.
say that it might not have been an earthquake.
No, maybe it was a test. I mean, no, maybe it was, but I heard that there are sensors out there that can pick this type of stuff out. If there's uranium floating around the atmosphere, whatever. So I assume someone will know, and then there's a man will run down a hallway in Washington somewhere saying, oh, they've got a bomb, it's very bad.
And maybe then they'll smell the coffee. Yes.
You write thousands of words a day, a week, whatever, thousands and thousands, to tell us what's going on in the paper. I imagine there's an awful lot that you know that you can't tell us. The question really is, how much is the public really informed about what's going on in reality?
Well, if we read his articles every day.
The public is not maybe that well informed, but that's not just because there's people hiding it from you. The people in charge are not well informed. I don't just mean here, but globally. I mean, someone just asked about tunnels, and someone else just asked about intelligence failures, and someone asked about this and that. The fact is that this country is very bright, but there's a lot of things we don't know, and we should always be willing to imagine that our enemies have a lot of things that we didn't even think about. I wrote a book about drones, and I predicted a bit of this drone problem, but I'll tell you, I mean, what we're seeing with the drone wars is crazy. I mean, and by the way, in Ukraine, I'm hearing that they're rolling out tens of thousands of drones a month, some of these things. I mean, it's wild what's happening. So there's a lot we don't know, but we'll hope for the best.
Any more questions? Yes.
You mentioned that this war is going to go on for a long time, and we have an army. It's also a war of economics. It's not just a military war, and there are many people called up to the reserves who are losing their businesses, and I wonder what the economic fallout will be over a lengthy period of time.
Well, I'll say that it's not great, although today we had some good news from the Bank of Israel. In Jerusalem, for example, tourism is non-existent. It was an important part of our economy. We had a good quarter, 2 quarters ago, in terms of foreign investment in innovation. Sometimes from war and conflict, great innovation comes forward, and maybe that gives us some hope. But between the reservists and between, the less investment there's going to be, and perhaps even another global recession or a mini recession, let's see what happens in America, it's not great. But like Seth said earlier, we have a very robust economy, we have good reserves, and we have the best thing of all, which is incredible innovative brains. Which means Israel's going to continue producing really wonderful things. The new trend now is dual-use technology. What does that mean? It means stuff that we're using for the war to win the war now has also civilian purposes, and so we can now sell it for different things. And so the prediction is not great for next year, but it's actually today the Bank of Israel announced it might be a little better than we thought. Hashem Gadol, what can I tell you? Yes, Jeff?
Seth, your coverage of the region has been fantastic. Have you been in touch with your friends in different areas in the region? How did they react to October 7th? How did they react to our reaction to October 7th? And have their perceptions been evolving over the course of the past couple of weeks? In particular, the Peshmerga in Kurdistan.
Yeah, I mean, no, I was pleasantly surprised that I had lots of well-wishers from from the Kurdistan region and from other groups and stuff, and lots of people that wish their support for us and express sorrow and things that we were going through. What many of these groups had faced, because like the Kurds during the Anfal campaign, I mean, they were exposed to massacres, like we are suffering here on October 7th, but that went on for years and it was much larger. So, and of course the Yazidi people and others.
Yeah.
So I think
That one girl that was just
yes, they just
Yes.
were able to get this woman out of Gaza.
Georgia.
Right, it's phenomenal.
I honestly get tons of messages from Muslim friends in Morocco and in other places around the region, and the more we succeed, the more they like us. Honestly, they're like the beepers. I don't know how many messages of well done Israel I got from Muslim Arabs from around the Gulf. This is what they want to see. This is what they make peace with, a strong Israel.
Yes.
Right. That's what they want. Over there, gentlemen, first of all, we start with the lady. Oh, you've already asked a question.
You're an amazing journalist.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, what do you think of the political and military decision-making that's going on in Israel today?
Well, political decision making, I don't know what's going on. Military decision making, I think this 3 weeks of the destruction of Hezbollah or destruction of pieces of it is extraordinary. I mean, that's Israel on its best day. It's like the 1967 war type of stuff. Yeah. But we have seen months of dragging our feet and not being willing to take risks and not coming up with a strategy and sitting around, for instance. I remember in Gaza when there was this weird de facto ceasefire in Ramadan, which probably should never have happened, and then waiting to go into Rafah and the government saying we have a plan, but we want to go in, we're going to go in, we might go in. That totally unacceptable. And you mentioned the endless months in reserve duty of the reservists. 300,000 people called up. People spent 8 months out of the last 12 in the reserves, and a lot of it was spent sitting around. And I think think Israel knew back in '67, why do you fight a 6-day war? Because you can't do this forever. So here and there are points of light, but there's points of sitting.
Is Bibi
Sitting.
making the real decisions? What do you think of? You wrote about Gallant in the column today.
We know the Gallant story is kind of more kind of well known in an interesting way, because Gallant is known for wanting to destroy Hezbollah on October 11th or 10th and saying, let's do a preemptive strike and destroy these people. And he was held back. And he has wanted, his dream is to go in there and destroy them. But he's also extremely traumatized by October 7th. He never stops wearing black because he's extremely traumatized, but under his defense ministry, that he feels that this tragedy happened, and him and the rest of the line of command, from maybe down to the division commanders and brigade commanders, maybe will be remembered for this, and that's just that will be part of their legacy, and they can never get out of that. What they'll have to do is what Bibi said about like FDR. Well, they had Pearl Harbor, but then things went well. Yeah. We don't know where that will go, but I think the story.
I think one last question.
Yeah. I think so.
Do you expect heads to roll when this war is eventually over, and who is likely to take over?
Take over where? As the Prime
To
Minister?
replace the fallen heads,
Well, the big
whoever
debate
they
at
may
the moment in Israel
be.
is, will there be a Vadat Hakira, a public inquiry or investigation? I certainly believe there has to be. And I hope it happens. Seth, what do you think?
No, I think most of the military command that was involved will eventually leave. They'll resign or leave. Bit by bit, they are resigning. In terms of the top-level political people, what we've seen generally in narrative is we don't want a Vad Hakara, we don't want that, and we don't really feel that we're at fault. So I think there's a question mark at some point if the political leadership will come out one by one and say, yeah, you know what, we messed up, and our time in office is finished. I assume Gallant will leave office eventually. I mean, once he feels that he's destroyed Hezbollah, I think. But the rest of the ministers and Netanyahu, I just don't know. But the evidence so far has not shown a sense of like a sense of we made mistakes, like and let's go, like Anthony Eden left or Neville Chamberlain, whatever your historical example might be. So we'll see. Yeah, it's the middle of the war. So we have years to go, and we'll see.
We have years to go, and there's a reason why there's no word for accountability in Hebrew. Let's pray we invent one. Thank you all. Thank you very much.
I want to thank Seth Frantzman and Fleur Hassan-Nahum. Thank you very much. There are books to be bought, and Seth will sign them, of course. We have another event here on Monday. Another book launch is Salt on Judaism by Gal Kalev. Gal will be here with Melanie Phillips to talk about that, so you should come to that. Information on our website. Email me.